Hi, my name is Mike Howell. I'm a reporter with Glacier Media, and today I'll be speaking with Scott Fraser, the BC government's Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. This interview is part of a podcast of discussions that examine Indigenous issues in British Columbia as we approach National Indigenous Peoples Day, which goes Sunday, June 21st. Mr. Fraser, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure, Mike. Thank you.
I know your time is limited to answer questions, so let's get right to it. I want to start by asking you what National Indigenous Peoples Day means to you.
Well, still, every year, we recognize that Indigenous people have lived here in this province or in this country too for millennia, for a long, long time, and we honor and respect the rights that I think that are inherent in that history, and that the history that has helped make this province what it is today. In general, this year it is, I think, a more compelling day because of world events. And even though we are dealing with a pandemic and we have to find creative ways to recognize this important day, the world has shown us some pretty nasty things and has confirmed that inherent racism exists, and that we all have to be a part of fixing that.
Yeah, no, I know last week the Prime Minister said that systemic racism exists in all Canadian institutions. Do you believe that to be true of the BC government?
I began this job in 2005. I got elected first then, so going on 16 years ago, and I was the critic for the opposition in Indigenous affairs. And I remember reading over literature. Now it's 25 years old, but it was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and that significant piece of work recognized that systemic racism existed within institutions, within governments, within policing throughout the country. And while even if it's not obvious, it is there. And sometimes it is more obvious. But I would reflect that governments generally didn't do anything about that. And so it's been a long time that we had to address the issues of systemic racism. And it means we need to double down now and get that work done.
So how would you describe the BC government's relationship with the province's Indigenous community?
So we're just coming up to our third year in government, and what our approach was to change the Crown Indigenous relationship in fundamental ways. And we've been working to do that cross government. The Premier, in our mandate letters to all ministers, put in that mandate letter the need for us to work towards recognizing the rights and title of Indigenous peoples, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. They were all part of our mandate letters. So we brought in last fall, we brought in the first jurisdiction to bring in formal legislation recognizing the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples in law in this province through that act. And our relationship has been built on, we built that piece of legislation with Indigenous peoples in this province, with First Nations. And that has never been done before. So we've changed the way we do things in government. And we've broken down barriers and silos within government too, because every minister, like Minister Robinson in housing, has provided $550 million towards Indigenous housing off and on reserve. That's never been done before on reserve, the provincial government, ever in this country. We've got Minister Eby, the Attorney General, reforming parts of the justice system, where all of this working in conjunction with First Nations and Indigenous peoples. Minister Simpson on poverty reduction, Minister Darcy on mental health and addictions. Across the board, government is working cooperatively with First Nations in partnership, and because of that, getting better results, and I believe a much improved relationship.
In talking with Chief Terry Teegee last week, he was saying that First Nations are working in this province towards asserting their own sovereignty and becoming self-sufficient. So you touched on a few things there, but what is the BC government doing to make that happen, where First Nations can
Yeah.
assert their own sovereignty and become more self-sufficient?
Well, stable long-term funding is a piece of that, Mike. There's a bunch of pieces to that. And under the Indian Act, you don't First Nations communities don't get stable long-term funding, discretionary funding at all. Every government needs that, including First Nations governments. So we began the largest revenue sharing in the history of this province with Indigenous peoples, $3 billion over 25 years through gaming. It's about $100 million a year to every one of the 204 First Nations communities in the province. Not a transaction, to improve capacity and the ability of First Nations to work with us as government, to engage in partnerships, to have autonomy as governments. So that helps. We also invested early on, one of my first budget I was involved in as minister, $50 million towards revitalization of Indigenous languages. It's not just language for language's sake. It's about identity. It's about culture. It's about history, and strengthening all of that. So again, there's a number of ways to approach that, but those are the two biggest endeavors I think that we've engaged on to answer the question.
So I'm curious if your ministry's focus has shifted in recent weeks in light of the demonstrations in BC and across the world, really calling for systemic change in institutions to wipe out racism.
And the first part of wiping out racism is acknowledging that it exists. So, and we do. I think the changes we've made as government from the beginning 3 years ago recognized these challenges, and that's why we made those changes and continue to work on them. We're looking at legislation through the UN Declaration, the act we brought in. We're looking at legislation across the board with First Nations and Indigenous peoples to change legislation that's not reflective of the articles within the UN Declaration. So we're continuing with that too. The recent events, I know it certainly brings a spotlight into policing in this country. And I know the Solicitor General has made commitments just in the last 2 weeks as a result to do a formal review of the Police Act in this province. My understanding is it hasn't even been looked at for 45 years.
Right. Yeah.
So the Police Act in this province is reflective of a 45 years ago. And long overdue.
Why do you think, I think a lot of people know the answer to this question, I'm sure you do, but why are Indigenous people overrepresented in prisons, homeless counts, overdoses in British Columbia? And what is your government doing to address that?
Like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, I attended a number of the hearings when they were doing their traveling work around the country, and they were full houses everywhere. I mean, the colonial history of this province is a very dark one. I would note when I went to school to K to 12, I was never taught the real history of this country. And so there are a number of things. We've changed the curriculum K to 12 to reflect the real history of this province. And that includes things like the residential school system, which did untold damage to generations of Indigenous peoples in this province. A horrific practice by the state for decades and for generations. It caused huge damage and left huge scars to Indigenous people in this province. A credit to First Nations and Indigenous peoples to be here and fighting for their rights and titles in many cases with First Nations in a respectful, strong way. In the aftermath of that horrendous part of our history. So it was a generational thing, taking away kids from their family by the police and state, as part of practice sanctioned by the church and state and by enforced by policing. All of that has brought us to where we are. All that part of history has brought us to where we are today. So recognizing the cause and causes is part of the solution. Working in partnership with Indigenous peoples to change the trajectory of what happened. It takes time, but we're committed to it.
Maybe you've answered this already, but what proof do you have that the BC government's commitment to reconciliation is genuine?
Well, I would, as evidence, Mike, I would suggest that being the only jurisdiction in North America, possibly in the world, to bring in legislation recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act is very compelling. It provides a path forward in partnership with Indigenous people to address all of the issues we talked about. And so that's the change in the Crown Indigenous relationship. But I'd heard in opposition as critic for about 12 years, things that were needed for government to do and were not being done, like revenue sharing through gaming, that other provinces had been doing for many years, and this province had refused to do so, like providing needed housing on reserve, where there's often deplorable housing situations. The province, it's not technically their responsibility. We decided that was a key issue we needed to address one way or another, and that shouldn't be Indigenous people and Indigenous communities that pay the price for that. If the federal government was not living up to their obligations, for instance, that we would take that on. So, again, investing in language, investing in, changing the curriculum K-12, changing attitudes by providing the facts about the history of this province and this country. All of that, I think, evidences a change, a fundamental change in the relationship between the Crown, the government, the provincial government, and Indigenous people in this province.
You sound pretty optimistic. I'm just wondering about the future of the BC government's relationship with the province's Indigenous people. What do you base that optimism on?
Well, it's the people that I have met in my 16 years as an MLA, 12 in opposition as critic, 3 as minister. I've met the most amazing people in this province. Prior to me becoming the critic in 2005, I was the mayor in Tofino. I sat on a board called the Clayoquot Sound Central Region Board, and I worked with Nuu leadership and the hereditary chief for Ahouhsat at the time. He's passed since, Earl Maquinna George, wonderful, wonderful man. And he taught me a term called, I'll see if I can do it. It took me about a year to figure out how to say it with his training, but ishu, gish, sawak. All things are connected. Everything is one. And that's wisdom that I've taken with me into government. That when we make decisions in government, there are side effects. There are ripples that happen, that and unforeseen consequences sometimes are not looked at. So that type of wisdom has given me optimism. That wisdom survives, a very dark history in this province, and here we are. And here I was in 2005 and before, learning that wisdom from a hereditary chief. So that gives me lots of optimism for the future. First Nations and Indigenous people in this province have provided so much to this province and continue to. But us working in partnership with First Nations will help bring certainty, predictability to this province on the land base. It'll make us a fairer and more just place, which is something we all want to see. So and being able to embark down that road as a government for the first time in many ways, it gives me that optimism.
Okay, just a couple more and I'll wrap up. I just wanted to get your assessment on how the government handled the Coastal GasLink demonstrations.
Well, I'm a firm believer in the right to peaceful demonstration, so I very much supported the people, in their right to protest. The Coastal GasLink project was approved many years ago. Permits were in place. They had met or exceeded the requirements for consultation with all the First Nations along the pipeline path, and the project is moving forward. That being said, it was about a year ago now that we had we began working with the hereditary chiefs, who in 1997, in the Delgamuukw-Gistayaway court case, were given, the court had said that the rights and title existed, and they didn't go. The court didn't go far enough. So we began work over a year ago with the hereditary chiefs to address that failure of governments to actually address the spirit and intent of that court case. So I was somewhat frustrated with the protests when we were actually involved in some very significant work and continue to. We've signed a memorandum of understanding with hereditary chiefs to, as a path forward, the start of a process to actually recognize their rights and title of the Wet'suwet'en people. So we have this year, these protests, they were at the legislature, they were on the ground, on the land base. That was dealing with a Coastal GasLink project. It was not, our work. The way my priority was to work closely with hereditary chiefs and the elected chiefs to recognize the rights and title of the Wet'suwet'en people, and we continue on that work. And it's my hope is that it will lead to some reunification within Wet'suwet'en people and a stronger relationship between government and the Wet'suwet'en, so that what happened, the unrest and the protests, if we deal with the systemic causes of that, the failure to recognize rights and title, that this will not happen again in the future.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned systemic, just so I'm hearing you clearly on systemic racism. Do you believe that exists in the institution of the provincial government?
Yes. I believe, I mean, the evidence is there through, again, from 25 years ago, and attitudes are slow to change. It requires leadership from all of us. We have to address racism by recognizing that it exists. It is systemic within institutions, within governments, within policing, and the solutions there are many, and including having a curriculum that appropriately addresses the history of this province and this country and where we came from and what really happened. And so, and that, that's going to take a little while. But in the meantime, a review of the full review of our Police Act and how we do things in this province is going to be underway. And things like racism and intolerance are usually based on ignorance. And so I'm a firm believer that education is a big piece of changing that. We brought the first Indigenous law degree in the province, in the country, in the world at the University of Victoria. We have sponsored that as a government. It's just the most amazing opportunity for the classes are full. We're going to get a cohort of in a couple of years of lawyers coming out with not just British common law but Indigenous law under their belt. Again, these are pieces of a puzzle. How do you solve the ignorance that leads to intolerance and racism? And that's how you do it.
Finally, how are you going to mark National Indigenous Peoples Day this Sunday?
I have been involved in a number of virtual events, and part of today has been recording those so that I can take part in a number of events throughout the province. And I've been fortunate enough in my role as critic and minister now to have been able to be involved in a number of celebrations of National Indigenous Peoples Day throughout the province, different places. And I regret not being able to be there in person, but it is the next best thing. And the one good thing about this technology is it allows me to be at multiple events throughout the province. So I can take part in them one way or another.
As long as it doesn't crash.
As long as it doesn't crash. And I'm not technically very adept, Mike, so I've had my problems with some of this new technology, or it seems new to me.
Okay. Well, that's all the time we have today, Minister. I just wanted to thank you for joining me. It was an interesting discussion. Maybe we can pick this up again some other time, but thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Mike, thanks for helping us all celebrate National Indigenous Peoples Day this year. It's been a pleasure, and anytime.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.